So without any further ado, let us welcome Dr. Stephen Lekson.
We have a lot of technology going on up here right now, so bear with me while I figure out down from up. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming out tonight, and my thanks to the Sedona chapter of the Arizona Archaeological Society and this very exciting new archaeological center down at Camp Verde for bringing me in. At dinner, I was realizing it's probably about 30 years since I've been to Sedona. I mean, I remember it being this pretty, but I don't remember quite so many buildings, and I don't remember the traffic circles. I mean, I get up to Flagstaff a lot, and I get to Phoenix a lot, but I miss the nice part. It's a very, very beautiful place. Okay, let's launch right into it here. Southwest archaeologist, and worked like Mesa Verde sites, Chaco Canyon, places like that. In the northern Southwest, that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I'll mention a bit of the southern Southwest, which is where I'm working now, and not in Hohokam, but in the southern New Mexico area. But southwestern archaeology really started around the northern Southwest and around the Pueblos. When you think about the pioneer archaeologists, Bandelier and Cushing and Fuchs, they were essentially ethnologists, people that studied living cultures and taking that back into the past. Literally, in the sense of trying to substantiate migration stories that Pueblo people told, not migration stories, migration histories that Pueblo people recounted. This is it's a Hopi painter. It's Fred Cabote painting, I think, a generic Rio Grande Pueblo. And in southwestern archaeology, we congratulate ourselves on the many advantages of southwestern archaeology, the fine preservation, the tree ring dating, stuff like that, but living descendant people, which is truly wonderful. I mean, it's just wonderful to have the descendants of the people that lived at Chaco or helped build Chaco and Mesa Verde and places like that. But it's also over the years, and I mean over the years, over decades, over a century, put us in a bit of a bind as archaeologists. We're not comfortable, and again, I'm talking about the northern Southwest, we're not comfortable about a past that's too different than the present. Now, there's a lot that's going on here, like there's some tourists over there and there's a Catholic church and all that. You know, there's a lot of change in the present, but, and I'll get into this later, the archaeologists have developed, there's a lot of archaeologists out there, they have a lot of different ideas, but sort of a Pueblo space in which we're comfortable in thinking, that it can be, the past can be a little different than that what we conceive of as a Pueblo Volchandong or whatever, but not too different. And what they call systematics are ways of understanding, understanding the past. For the northern Southwest, that's a thing called the Pecos. It started off with a thing called the Pecos System, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, Basket Maker 3 and Pueblo 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to go into these in detail, but the way they were set up, let's see if this will work. Yes. The way they're set up, ideally, and of course over the decades, the details have changed. But you start off in Basket Maker 3 with corn. I don't know if you can see this. The resolution on the screen is not all that wonderful. You start off with corn in Basket Maker 2, excuse me. And then you had pottery, all right? And then you had stone masonry, and this accumulates. Then you had kivas in P2 and massed pueblos with all this other stuff. It's like these guys down here are just, they know what they need to do to become, okay, they need cachinas next to become that. The way the archaeologists saw this is that you're adding one thing after another to turn these guys into these guys in the most efficient way possible. A straight line from the distant past, and at this point we didn't know what the dates were and all that stuff, from the distant past to a modern Pueblo, and in the most efficient way you can. And you just add an element, add an element, and bingo, you come out with, I don't know, Santa Clara, whatever that is. It's like the guys in Pueblo 2 are sitting there going, oh man, if we were only in Pueblo 3, we would have Pueblos. I mean, that much closer to being Hopi, And they may have had prophecies, who knows, but I don't think these guys down here knew anything about what was going to happen 800 years later. They're living history from past to present. They're in a forward gear. They don't have a clue what's over the horizon. I mean, over the distant horizon. Okay, so that's led to, in archaeology, knowing how the story ends, and developing this way of thinking about the past where, you're trying to explain where this came from. It leads to sort of an odd chronological structure, originally called the direct historic approach. This is archaeology jargon, sorry. Where you start with what's known in the present and move back to the past. And this is what people like Alfred Kidder did, or J.O. Brew, where you go to a site that has a Catholic church on it, a Catholic mission, a ruin, as a mission, and then you have those records. So you have some known present, and then you work back into an unknown past. That makes logical sense. You got to start somewhere. And then later, this gets called ethnographic analogy, where you look at a site from the ancient past and you say, oh, that looks like a kiva. And Fuchs is great at this. He says, you've got this little round room at Mesa Verde. He had hundreds of them. And it kind of looks like what I've seen at Hopi. It's a kiva, so therefore that's a kiva. Ethnographic analogy, that has turned into what's called upstreaming, which is literally taking the present and pushing it as far back in the past as you can. Pushing kivas as far back as you can, pushing kachinas as far back as you can, working from the present to the past. And if you think about it for more than 20 seconds, this is nuts, okay? Because time doesn't work that way. Time goes from the past to the present. Time does not go from the present to the past. But this is, we're training graduate students to say upstreaming. That's what you should be doing. I'm sitting there going, ooh, this is not healthy. It allows you to do stuff like taking Cliff Palace and just painting a bunch of Hopis. I'm sorry about the resolution. I don't know how you can see this, but the artist decided to put in a young lady with the butterfly hairdo there. To understand Mesa Verde, all you have to know is Hopi, as much as you can know about Hopi. Makes it really easy to be an archaeologist. You don't have to think much. Just take modern Pueblo, paste it in the past. Now, no archaeologist operates this way. I'm being facetious, and I'm trying to make a point here. But that's that Pueblo space I'm thinking of. That's what we're comfortable with, is thinking about a place like that. If we have to populate that with, we being archaeologists, if we have to populate that with people, we think about the Pueblo present, our stereotype in a sense of the Pueblo present. There are some dangers with upstreaming. Again, that's not the way that time works. It doesn't allow anybody to have a history. They do have a history, but it's a history that's in lockstep and a very, very linear sort of history where you start with somebody in the past that isn't a Pueblo and then they turn into a Pueblo over a millennium or something like that. They can't take any detours. And thinking about how to think about this stuff, I think we have an event in the past, okay? And instead of working from it's wonderful that the Pueblos are here, and you always want to start and stop in your research thinking about Pueblos. But let's define some event in the past and then triangulate it. Look at what do we know about what came immediately before it? What do we know about what happened immediately after it? And I like to alliterate. So these should probably be contemporaries, but what do we know about what was going on at the same time that might allow us to understand what was going on in the past without shooting from the present back to the past, although the present's always there. That Pueblo box is always leaning over our shoulders. And I tried to do that in this book that came out, where I tried to write a narrative history of the ancient Southwest from the beginning to the end, not from the end to the beginning. And this is hard to do, but I tried to let myself be surprised at what happened next, even though I knew what happened next. Again, because that's how history works. It works from the past to the present. And not everything in history does work. They could do some stuff in the past that went nowhere. They could do some stuff in the past that went someplace really interesting, but it's not represented in modern Pueblos. And I'll show you. Going to take you through a real quick tour of the ancient Southwest, and do not despair. It's going to go real quick, and then I'll go back and talk about it again. Just the basic terminologies here with Anasazi or Ancestral Pueblo being mostly what I'm talking about, the ancestors of Pueblo people. Hohokam being the really, really interesting stuff that's under Phoenix today in Tucson. And then Mogollon, which I'll mostly talk about members, is this great sort of undifferentiated area here. It's really a number of separate entities or no entities at all. I think members is mostly in this part of New Mexico. That's where I'm working right now. But those terms will pop up. And these are three contemporary archaeological entities In the case of Hohokam and Anasazi, Ancestral Pueblo, I think they're certainly different peoples. I'm not so sure about these guys. But that's the way archaeologists organize space, now that we've gotten through organizing time. So, if everything works here, we're going to do the Southwest in 60 seconds. Do not despair. We're going to go back over it again. Okay, you start off with early agricultural stuff in about 1200, 1500 BC. It turns into Hohokam. It explodes out from Phoenix. Great houses form in the northern San Juan in reaction to this. And whoop, okay, there we go. So great houses move to Chaco. The Chaco expands while Hohokam contracts. We're going to go over this again. All right, then a volcano blows up. Chaco moves north to Aztec. Both systems shrink in on themselves and change their architecture enormously. The Aztec with bi-walls and platform mounds. The Four Corners is abandoned, and people go to Santa Fe and down to here, and this is part of what happens with Salado. A whole lot of folks show up in the Casas Grandes Valley, and you have Casas Grandes. This has turned into pueblos now. They're not interesting anymore. Hohokam goes away. They turn to Odom. They're not interesting anymore. Okay, Casas Grandes goes away. I don't know if it turns into the Sonoran statelets or not. I'll talk about that in a minute. So then you have the Southwest by 1600, 1700 with people in place. And then some real bad stuff happens. Okay. So now you don't need to buy the book. You've seen the major motion picture. Let's try this again. Early agricultural is really, really interesting. It's something that truly one of the revolutionary things in the Southwest in the last even 10 years, maybe 20 years, where big agricultural villages at 1500 BC, 1200 BC. These are mostly known from under Tucson. Every time they put a new freeway in Tucson, they find one of these pit houses as far as the eye can see with canals and corn. And this is 1500, 1200 BC, okay? And we really didn't know about this. I mean, Bruce Huckle and some other people were snipping around the edges of it 20 or 30 years ago, but it's really exploded. And one of the coolest early agricultural sites is actually not under Tucson. It's over in Chihuahua, called Cerro Kenya, and there should be a tilde over the end there. Okay, you have hundreds of pit houses. Are they all occupied at once? If they are, that's a big town. Well, in the Tucson Basin, a lot of archaeologists think, no, there's only, like 5 or 6 that are occupied at any one time. And, it's people coming back and reusing fields. I don't know. Cerro Kenya is a hillside, and I have nothing for scale here except a tree. That's a tree. It's a big hill, okay? And it's all terraced with these stone terraces that were platforms for building small pit houses on. Hundreds and hundreds of these terraces. I don't think that's reuse of that site. I think that probably most of those pit houses are contemporary, so there are hundreds of pit houses. This is 1250, somewhere about 1200 BC, something like that, with corn. No pottery. This is way before pottery. And what's up with this? This is something that is really new in the Southwest. Where we mostly know about it is not in Chihuahua, there's more of it there, but over in Tucson, and it percolates in Tucson for centuries and centuries. I think it shifts up into, let's see if we can do this. It shifts up into the Phoenix Basin, and it blows out in all directions in the 400, 500 AD in Hohokam. Hohokam, I'll show you a slide in a second here. Hohokam really does crystallize in the Phoenix Basin, and it really does move upstream, and it's sort of scary. It scares these guys. It scares them half to death up on the plateau. And they build great houses. This is a set of Hohokam gentlemen who are heavily restored, little figurines like that, and marching Hohokam people, marching out in all directions. And the response up north, or a response, I don't think it's a coincidence. That's one of the ground rules of my book, is there probably aren't many coincidences. If this is happening in Phoenix and getting the attention up north, the reaction is to build a thing called a great house. And this is one of the later ones at Pueblo Bonito, where in a Pueblo I village, and this would be 900 AD, something like that, one of the houses will be much bigger and much more substantially built than the other houses in that village. They eventually turn into places like Pueblo Bonito. They bounce around a lot. They don't last long. They last about a generation, and they'll move in the next valley and do it again. They finally move to Chaco, and I think that's the next slide. They move to Chaco, and it takes. So Chaco becomes a center, and it has its region. I think you've probably all heard about this with roads radiating out and smaller great houses. While Chaco's expanding, Hohokam is contracting. It's like a 1-2 punch. Hohokam bursts out early, up to about 1000 AD, something like that, and it starts to fall in on itself. It's not that people are disappearing necessarily, but they're opting out of whatever Hohokam was, which is a very tight package of stuff like ball courts and particular kind of pottery, and particularly of burying people. That goes away. You know, as this contracts, this expands. Again, I don't think that's a coincidence. And one way I see this is in the members' country, the members' Mogollon country. When Hohokam is going strong, they pay a lot of attention to that. There's all kinds of Hohokam stuff over in the members' country. They're like a weather vane. When Hohokam starts to wane, they spin north, and there's all kinds of Chaco stuff. That's Chaco. That's the 800-pound gorilla of the, and that's a guy from Chaco, and that's the guy from members. After 1000 AD, the members people who before that were perfectly happy making red on brown pottery, sort of like the red on buff pottery of Hohokam, and having similar sort, at least some of them similar sorts of burial practices, and possibly even ball courts, things like that. They give up on all that and they start paying attention to the north, because the north is what's happening. The north's where the energy is. Start painting this fantastic black and white pottery and making corrugated pottery just like the guys up north, and having 5 rooms in a kiva just like up north. So out on the periphery in the members is where you can actually see the regional dynamics. You can sort of see them paying attention to Hohokam, and when Hohokam withers, they start paying attention to Chaco. Okay, then a volcano goes off. Chaco moves north, gets away from it, to Aztec ruins. And the areas that you could call Hohokam, that you could call Chaco, because Aztec was a second Chaco. Whoa, wait a minute. I'm not ready for that yet. They keep going as regional entities, but there's a dramatic change in their signatures, the way the archaeologists can see them. From ball courts, these oval ball courts, to platform mounds, and from great houses to bi-walls and tri-walls. And I think I got a picture of that. Okay, there's Sunset Crater, but it's a stunt double, body double, whatever. When Sunset Crater goes off, and I'm sure most of you know this, actually, I get a different story every time I talk to people who are working on it. That's not a bad thing. It means that we're learning. But I think they all agree that it shot a plume way, way, way high, tens of thousands of feet in the sky. That plume, it's a strombolian eruption, and it would have had an enormous amount of kinetic energy around the plume, so there would have been lightning almost continuously, day and night, in addition to bombs going off, or not bombs, but these things going off. You probably could have seen it from Phoenix. Some of the models think you could see it from Chaco. Everybody would have known about it. Even if you couldn't see it from Chaco, people from Chaco would have come over and taken a look, because this is really something. There hadn't been a volcano in the southwest in a long, 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 long time. So this plume's up in the air. It's the mother of all thunderstorms for a while, and then it subsides, but the place is still important. It turns into Wapaki. Chaco's reaction, and I don't know if it's just to the volcano, and it's probably some other internal politics going on here, is to move north to a place called Aztec Ruins. They built a second capital. Chaco was a capital, this center of this large region, the size of Ireland. They moved to Aztec. The center becomes smaller. It's still these, this building, probably everybody here's been to Aztec. That's Aztec West, I guess, that Earl Morris excavated, whose job I now have. That was the single biggest thing they ever built, the Chacoans. Now, Pueblo Bonito was a bigger building, but it took them 2.5 centuries to build it. They built most of this thing in a decade. And it's not Chaco on the skids. It's Chaco at the heights of its power in terms of organizing stuff. I mean, this is the biggest thing they ever built, single thing they ever built. And there's 3 more buildings like it at Aztec. They also start using these bi-walls and tri-walls, which are really, really central to the new center, central to the new center. And you see the bi-walls and tri-walls, we don't know what these things are. But there's this one right here is right smack dab in the middle, conceptually and geometrically, of the new capital at Aztec. It's right in the middle of it. And then you have tri-walls and bi-walls scattered all the way over to Utah that probably mark the new territory. Much smaller than Chaco's old territory, but still a big territory. And then down south, where they had these earthen oval ball courts that were the center of public attention, they start building platform mounds, which this is Pueblo Grande at the east end of the Phoenix airport. And Dave Wilcox is in the audience. He'll probably give me the exact dimensions, but it's like a couple of football fields big and 15, 20 feet tall, and that's all fill. Those of you that are up on Mississippian archaeology, that's bigger than anything at Cahokia, except the 2 biggest mounds at Cahokia. And there's scores of these things. But the territories contract. Okay, it ends badly up here. Aztec can't keep it together. Tens of thousands of people move. They move to where the Pueblos are now. They move beyond where Pueblos are now. I'm working on, I'm done at this point, working on a Mesa Verde village right about there, where a couple hundred people from Mesa Verde just upped and set themselves down on a butte, Pinnacle Ruin. Spilling over into the Gila, and Salado is probably a term you guys have heard, many of you have heard. They're part of that. Okay, this takes us up to about 1,300. 1,300 is a huge watershed up north and down south. Well, more up north and down south. I could give you a laundry list of what changes. It's like nothing that happened before 1,300. I'll take this out. That's too dramatic. A lot of what happens after 1,300 doesn't seem to refer to things that happened before 1,300. So it's like an enormous watershed in Pueblo history. And you can see it in the art. This is 1,300 right here, right? You go from this black and white geometric pottery, beautiful stuff, okay? But, very repetitive geometrics to these incredible, dynamic, asymmetrical, polychromatic pottery. Same thing happens with kiva murals, or murals, wall murals. This is a spectacular Pueblo II mural. Everybody gawks at this thing, all right? And it's pretty cool. This is a Pueblo IV mural. It's just a huge, Pueblo III to Pueblo IV. This is what they're thinking. This is their cosmos. This is their cosmology, probably, on the wall. Read the writing on the wall. Before 1,300, and this is after 1,300. Something changes here. Not the people, but the people's ideas. And probably some new people, too. Who knows? About 1250, in my book, a whole lot of people move into a valley that prior to that hadn't had a lot of people in it, and the Casas Grandes Valley, which is really the breadbasket of northern Chihuahua, and is a lovely place to visit, but not right now. That's really, I shouldn't joke about that. That's just tragic what's going on down here. Hohokam more or less goes away, and you have the modern Hohokam people and other descendant peoples that are in the area. But that whole business of platform mounds and all the pomp and circumstance that went with it, that goes away. This becomes the real center of gravity in the Southwest. It just happens to be in Chihuahua, all right? It's also known as Paquime, but Casas Grandes, really kicks off about 1250, and it's like a real big thing in a hurry from almost a standing start. And that's Paquime. It's an aerial, Adriel Heinze, I suspect, aerial. It's the last and greatest of the southwestern cities in some ways. It's most cosmopolitan, at least. Clearly connected to Mexico. It has ball courts, but not the oval ball courts of the Hohokam. It has I-shaped, I don't mean this kind of eye, but the I-shaped ball courts, same ball court you see at Chichen Itza or Tula or places like that. And probably people from West Mexico and Central Mexico mingling with the local folks. This is really interesting to me, that Paquime goes away about 1450, and there's been a lot of archaeology and arguments about where it came from, but much less about what happened to it, where'd it go? This area empties out, and the Rio Sonora, when the Spanish come through, in their accounts of the peoples of the Southwest, the peoples of the Rio Sonora were by far the most politically complicated. When you read about it, it sounds like there should be cities and empires down there. These are the Spanish accounts of the people that they met. You go down and look at the archaeology, and it's really uninspiring. And that's why nobody's ever heard of it. It's just a bunch of little upright rocks. I wouldn't be surprised if the Rio Sonora, that stuff only lasts for about 50 years. It's gone when the next Spanish come through. If that was the last gasp of political complexity in the Southwest, all these folks are living like modern Pueblo people, which, what does that mean? That's that box I was talking about, where you're egalitarian, you don't have kings. You have people make decisions, because you can't have a town without somebody making decisions, but you don't have offices that people enjoy or vie for. They don't run for president in a Pueblo. They run for governor, but it's a duty. It's not a nice thing. It's something you're doing because you're a good citizen. So they're egalitarian. There's some communalism going on there. They're independent villages. You don't have overarching political systems with a capital in the middle. This is the last place you had stuff like that, and then it went away. My guess is that this last vestige of political power, these are families that are used to this. They've been ruling the roost for many, many years, many, many generations. And they're doing it in a place where the infrastructure is not there anymore. They're doing it just on sheer will, if you will. And the Spanish come through and they see these people that they're describing as lords and kings. And then you go back and look at the actual on-the-ground archaeology, and it's not much. So it's the last little bit where political power dies hard. It's like a giant cactus. It doesn't know it's dead for years. And that gets you to the modern Southwest, which, interestingly enough, you don't have a lot of people you know about down there when the Spanish are coming through. Okay, that's a real abbreviated version of a history of the ancient Southwest, but I think it's a very different version than that Pueblo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it was, sequence I showed you at the beginning. There's real history there with rises and falls and war and peace and stuff that started and didn't succeed and stuff that didn't make it to the next level to become Hopi or whatever. And most importantly, there are rulers. In the book, I call them kings, and that's because I was at a meeting about Chaco Canyon, which is a place where these guys lived, whatever we want to call them, and I'll tell you what to call them in a minute, with a Navajo guy. And we're sitting around, there's all these white guys sitting around the table, and this one Navajo fellow, Black Horse, some of you may know him, who's from a clan in the Chaco area, looking at places like Pueblo Bonito. And we're talking about a Navajo story, and insofar as we know these stories, about a guy named the Great Gambler who enslaves everyone, Pueblo people, Navajo people, and he makes them build them houses. Build me a palace, build a palace for my cousin Leo, build me a palace for my sister. And that's what those buildings are at Chaco, according to this story. And we're calling him the Great Gambler, and Taft says, well, that guy you call the Great Gambler, he's a king. I said, Taft, is there a word in Navajo for king? He said, no, but if we had a word for that's what he'd be. He's not just some episode. He represents powerful leadership who was actually there on the ground. Okay, the conclusions for this book, I'm going to come back to that point. Conclusions for this book, think big and don't sell them short, and because this matters. What do I mean by that? Think big. Here's the Southwest, more or less, and it's on North America. There are no international boundaries here, all right? There's an international boundary that is the result of a war we fought in 1846, 1847, somewhere in there, that totally structures how we think about the past, how archaeology thinks about the past. It wasn't there then. When I'm talking about triangulating, about what came before, what came after, and what was contemporary with what we're, and I'm going to talk about Chaco a bit more, with Chaco, for example. It shouldn't just be in this circle here. It should be what's going on here, what's going on there, what's going on over there. You need to think big. There's Pueblo Bonito down there. Okay. The original excavator of Pueblo Bonito was Neil Judd, and he treated it like it was a separate Pueblo village. In fact, he had a couple of informants. One is Santiago Naranjo from Santa Clara, I believe, who worked with him. And Neil Judd would dig all summer, and then he'd come ask his Pueblo informants, his Pueblo friends, what's that, what's that, what's that? And they tell him the best they could. I mean, again, it was pretty easy being an archaeologist back then. I think, not that, Judd was a very smart man, but that's what he did in that day. To talk about, you can't just talk about Pueblo Bonito, you have to talk about all of Chaco Canyon. I'll make that case in a minute here. And you actually have to talk about that being the center of the San Juan Basin. And you actually have to talk about that being over most of the southern Colorado Plateau. And you have to realize it's the northwest part of Mesoamerica, or the civilizations of what today is Mexico. This is an interesting term, which he is looking at the whole problem upside down, looking at it from Mexico, as opposed to looking at Chaco and saying, oh, what's from Mexico here? If you go to the National Museum in Mexico City, I mean, they have a little hall for the Southwest. It's part of their world, intellectually. We have to argue about whether Pueblo Bonito had connections with Mesoamerica. Nobody deny it now, but this is the term that refers, if you were an ancient Mesoamerican, would refer to the north, the Gran Chichimeca, and we don't know that much about it, but it'd be really interesting to try and interpret the Southwest and Pueblo Bonito as if you were a Mesoamerican noble down in Tula. It would be something up in the Gran Chichimeca. Mesoamerica is part of it, and I would say that if you're going to triangulate, you need to think about the Mississippi Valley and the California coast. Now, maybe you don't have to go that far, but I would say any archaeologist who's trying to deal with Pueblo Bonito, and many of us are, that doesn't actually go at least that far, is probably not doing his or her job. Okay, don't sell them short. My first conclusion was think big. Don't sell them short. North American archaeologists are trained to be parsimonious. What does that mean? It doesn't mean what we think it means. Parsimony is, and this is going to get a little too technical here, but parsimony is a logical property where if you have something you're trying to explain, like that piano, and you have two explanations that otherwise they explain the piano. I'll have to back up and I'll do this with the sun or something like that. that you take the one that has the least steps. It's simpler in the sense of its logical structure. Say, let's explain the sun. That you have two explanations of the sun, and one is why does the sun come up in the morning? Well, one explanation is it's a god. That's the god's job. He comes up in the morning. That's pretty simple. Takes care of business. Another explanation might be Big Bang, universe forms, solar system, Earth spinning around. That's a much less parsimonious explanation, but it's probably the one that's right. The sun's coming up in the morning because there's this long, involved cosmology behind it. I mean, cosmology in the physics sense behind it. Archaeologists have taken this way too often to say that interpreting what something is, it's simpler, is better than what something is more complicated. It's we make it a property of the thing to be explained rather than the explanations that we give. And then given a choice, and if we're looking in the past, and we have a choice of understanding it this way, A or B, we always take A. That's a Mesoamerican word there. But we think that's parsimonious, that's parsimony, and that's good science. It's not. It's nonsense. I mean, again, it's like going from the present to the past instead of the past to the present. It's putting some blinders on that, again, come from that Pueblo space that we like to operate in, that we're comfortable with. Okay, here's Chaco. And I'm just warming up. Okay, Chaco, to me, is one of the great failures of southwestern archaeology. All right? In 1973, I believe it was, when I was getting into this business, there was a textbook by Paul Martin and Fred Plog, two of the bright lights of that day, I think called The Archaeology of Arizona. That was the hot textbook of the time. And I don't know which of those two guys wrote this, but in that book, in this 73, they said, it's too bad we don't know anything about Chaco. It's probably an important place. Okay, decades later, we know a lot about Chaco. I mean, the quantity of archaeology that's happened since 73, or since 70 actually, both from the Park Service and in lots of other projects, thousands and thousands of new tree ring dates, thanks to Tom Wines and a bunch of other people. I would say that pound for pound, that we know more about Chaco than any other archaeological thing in its weight class. We know so much about it, okay? The archaeological explanations or the archaeological interpretations are all over the map. I was just reading a brand new book, something about ancient, before the revolution, by a guy named Dan Richter, historian. It's a history of the colonization of North America, where he starts off with Chaco. And this is a book that just came out. And he's a historian, and he just throws up his hand saying the archaeologists just are all over the map on Chaco. We know so much about it, but we have this incredible, staggering range, which I'll get to in a minute, of opinions on it. We don't fuss like that over Cliff Palace. We don't fuss like that over Poshawingi. For the other sites, we fuss over details. We don't have this range of ideas that we have about Chaco that's just really blindingly, blindingly is the right term here too, diverse. I put them in three camps, and this is not fair because there's a lot, these aren't like groups of archaeologists that run together. There's a lot of disagreement among the archaeologists that I shove into these categories. But first and foremost in mainstream is Chaco's Pueblo. Again, somewhere in that Pueblo space. It can be different than a Pueblo, but it can't be too different. All right, so these are folks that want Chaco to operate in terms of ritual and ceremony because that's commensurate with our ideas about how Pueblos work today. Now, it can be a little different, but it can't be that much different, all right? And that's truly the mainstream. I could name names. Well, there's no point in naming names. I mean, it's really good. We have this range of ideas, and these are all really, my point here is they're all really smart archaeologists looking at the same data and a lot of it and coming up with enormously different ideas. So this is the safe one. This leaves us in that space that we're comfortable with. There are people that are still trying to make Chaco into a canyon full of farming towns. The Pueblo Bonito is a little farming town. And these are not stupid people, these are smart people doing this. Okay, Chaco is a uniquity, which is really a word. Chaco is something we haven't seen someplace else. And this mainly comes from outsiders, and I'm responsible for a lot of this. Bringing in Norm Yaffe and Colin Renfrew, and people from the outside. This is part of a Chaco synthesis project I was working on, where we couldn't make up, the Southwest people couldn't make up their own minds, so let's bring in somebody from Britain, let's bring in somebody from Timpaucatat from the Mississippi Valley, let's bring in somebody from someplace else to look at it. And these guys would come in and look at Chaco and go, wow, that's really weird. But they had to play by our rules, and they all know about this sort of Pueblo space that's okay. So they'll come up with stuff that is different than Pueblo's, but still fits because it's mostly ritual and ceremonial. And I'll put pilgrimage center fans in here, where Chaco is an empty pilgrimage center, for example. And there are pilgrimage centers around the world, but that view of Chaco as an empty pilgrimage center where every once in a while, twice a year or something, thousands of people come in. There's not a lot of those in North America, or the Mesoamerican pilgrimage centers of this time, like Cholula. That was in Chaco's time. That was a huge, what was described as a pilgrimage center in Mesoamerica. Well, it was a bustling city, and all these places that were places where pilgrims went were bustling cities, and they didn't have these periodic influxes. So that sort of thing could have happened to Chaco, but it would make it very strange and very uniquity, something exceptional, all right? And those are very fashionable explanations now, because people are just not comfortable with Chaco as a pueblo. There's too many things that aren't right about Chaco, which I'll get to in a minute. So this makes us happy, because we can spin stories about ceremony and ritual, and it makes it sort of vaguely pueblo and makes us comfortable. Then there's Chaco's polity as a political organization, and Dave Wilcox is one of the first on this, Lynn Sebastian, and probably me, and a couple others. I mean, it's just a handful of people that really see it as a political center. This doesn't work either, because back when Dr. Wilcox and I were young, the language that we had as archaeologists to describe these political systems was it was a sort of theoretical stuff from anthropology about bands and tribes and chieftains and states. And Chaco doesn't work very well as any one of those things, too. But so including my own writing on Chaco as a polity, it just doesn't scan very well. I sit there and go, geez, that's pretty lame. Probably, I think it was what Dave said it was and what I said it was. But the language that we had to describe it in didn't quite click. So I'd say Chaco is, one of the great failures of southwestern archaeology. You could turn that on its head and say, that range of ideas is actually telling us something. Okay, what's the good side of this? What's the upside of this chaos? Well, the chaos is telling us that we don't have the chops, we don't have the tools, that Chaco is outside, it's off our radar. We don't, as southwestern archaeologists, we don't know how to deal with something like Chaco. Okay? Which I think is actually, we learned something when you say, we have this much information, enormous amounts of information about Chaco. We have this range of ideas. Probably that range of ideas is telling us not that archaeologists individually are stupid or anything. It's telling us that we don't actually have the tools to deal with it. What is it? Chaco. This is a contour map. All these little spaghetti lines are contours. Probably, who's been to Chaco? All right, next slide. There are 8 or 10, depending on how you want to count them, great big buildings, and these are Dennis Holloway reconstructions that are jammed into the canyon, and lots of other smaller interesting buildings, and lots of regular family houses, which I'll show you in a minute, jammed in the canyon. And it's only interesting because of these big buildings. If you got rid of all of what they call the smaller sites at Chaco, you'd still have a national park, because you have these big buildings. If you got rid of all these big buildings, you wouldn't have a national park. It would be interesting archaeologically, but you wouldn't have a park. So it's all about these buildings. And Chaco is also, and not all about these buildings, but the fact that Chaco is in the middle of a large area with road-like features radiating out, and this is the best map I could find on the web, oddly enough. It should be a lot more dots and a lot more roads. But clearly this was number 1 by a long shot, and number 2 is much smaller. Is that making sense? That, it's night and day between what's going on here and what's going on there. So these buildings, what are these things? This is the central issue in Chaco, I think, is what are these buildings? This is a regular family house, and it's a site at Chaco. It's actually 2 houses side by side with 4 little rooms and a little pit structure out front that we say are kivas because we want to see kivas in the past, okay? This is that site I just showed you, and Pueblo Bonito at the same scale. If you jam half of these things together, if you jammed it together in terms of floor space, you could fit it in one of the big rooms at Pueblo Bonito. It's night and day between these big buildings and what normal people live in. And this is 98% of the population, this is 2% of the population. Okay? I think looking at it objectively, if you can forget about that Pueblo space somehow, and just looking at it, Chaco is one of the most obvious cases of a palace civilization. This is Minoan Crete. Bronze Age Minoan Crete. For those of you that know the archaeology there, where you have palaces and countrysides, That's what you got at Chaco, and I think we've known that at least since the 1980s, that those big buildings are not pueblos. They're places where very important people lived, and they're people that were not the same as the people that are living in the other 98% of the population that is living in those smaller houses. So that's our guy from Pueblo Bonito. Well, he's not really from Pueblo Bonito, but he would have looked like that. They had all kinds of stuff that other people didn't have. They had macaw feathers. That's a macaw feather sash. That actually comes from Blanding, Utah. Well, actually from a cave up in southeast Utah, but it probably came from Chaco initially. And I'm sure you've heard about cacao being drunk in these very Mesoamerican looking cylinder vases. And they had control of turquoise, which is what was going the other way, and lots of other stuff. I mean, these guys were reasonably cosmopolitan, not compared to Casas Grandes, but for their day, Chaco was very well connected. So he really does want to be one of those. The guys that live in Chaco, I don't think are from Mexico. Some of them might be. But they are part of that world, and they know all about it. They think big. We should be thinking big, too. You think big, don't sell them short. I mean, this guy was part of this guy's world. He knew all about each other. Let him think big. If he wants to be that, don't sell him short. Let him be that, which I think he was. To triangulate this, all right, look at what's contemporary with Chaco, not at modern pueblos. Don't look at modern pueblos and push back. Look at what was going on immediately before and immediately after, and what was going on contemporaneously. These are the peers. And again, I like alliteration, so Chumash on the west coast, and Chaco and Cahokia and Calusa, and the post-classic down here. All these guys up north, not all these guys, but in a number of places up north, about 800 AD, 900 AD, it's not like they go postal, they go political, where you have what they call political complexity developing among the Chumash about 800 AD. Same with Chaco, same with Cahokia, same with Calusa. I don't think this is environmental because these guys are hunters and gatherers. These guys knew a little bit about corn, but they didn't really get big into corn until about 800 AD. These guys are hunters and gatherers, they're hunters and gatherers too, they're ocean-going folks. And then these guys had corn forever, so they all have different economies. And it's coast to coast, that it's all happening about the same time. Well, the common factor here is probably this. Post-classic in Mexico, the classic period is when you had Teotihuacan and a couple of giant cities, and they fell apart. Teotihuacan and Cholula. Cholula didn't fall apart. Teotihuacan falls apart, and that's the post-classic. And for the people that study it, the post-classic is one of the most dynamic periods in Mesoamerica. A lot of long-distance stuff. A lot of little polities that go on and off like Christmas tree lights that replace this big single city center that dominated most of northern Mesoamerica in the previous periods. Lots of long-distance stuff, okay? Lots of long-distance stuff. All right, so I got to thinking if we try and forget that Chaco's, that the people who lived in Chaco are going to turn into Pueblo people, if we forget that, we're trying to write our history and say, well, what was their world? What did they know? I could look at Chumash, I could look at Cahokia. I am looking at Cahokia, look at Calusa, but I mostly look at Mexico. That's the big center. And I was reading about Tarascan political systems, which is West Mexico, which is where all the copper bells and things that show up at Bonito and places like that come from. And the Tarascan political systems are very centralized. It's like Joe Stalin in the middle. When he says jump, you jump. That didn't seem right for Chaco. So I talked to a colleague of mine who works, a Mexican national guy who works in Mesoamerica, Gerardo Gutierrez. I said, look, this is what we got. You guys got anything down there that looks like this? And he says, oh yeah, no problem. We got that. I'm going to say it wrong. Any Nahua speakers in the group? Good. Altepetl. And I've actually heard a Nahua speaker say this, and it doesn't sound like what I just said. Altepetl, and that's the Nahua term. It wasn't just a Nahua thing. Nahua is Aztec. It's not just that, but that's the term that Mesoamerican archaeologists use for this, for a government that involves noble families and commoners in territories. And I'll show you how it works in a minute. You got to have noble families. You got to have people that live in palaces. And then you have commoners who owe that noble family, owe those nobles something, a couple of bushels of corn, little bit of work on their field. They come in every once in a while and, you know, patch up the house or whatever. It's not a slavery system, but it is tributary, okay? And Dave Wilcox wrote about tributary systems in Chaco a long time ago, and I think he's right. This is James Lockhart. You can't read that. This is the name of the guy that has done most of the work on altepetals. And he worked from codices. He worked from written documents, all right? So there's a logical flaw in what I'm about to tell you, which I'm sure some of you will pick up on here, that I'm pushing from the present to the past. But I'm assured that altepetals go way back in Mesoamerica. And this is a diagram of how one would work. You got Tecales, who are the noble families. They're living in palaces. And their palaces are pretty modest, actually. And they have a chunk of territory in their altepetal, all right? And there is a single central ruler, but he's elected by the noble families, and he serves until he dies. And then his son doesn't necessarily become the ruler. The noble families get together and say, okay, that family, this Tecali had its chances. Well, it's time for these guys, and they, put somebody up to be the central ruler. This palace is just as important as that palace, but the palaces tend to cluster around some central place where something happened in their history, a battle, or it's where they first settled when they migrated into the territory. Something important happened there, so they tend to cluster if they can, and they might have a palace here and a palace out in the country. But again, this is diagrammatic, okay? This is some guy reading the codices and sort of mapping out just for, in a diagram how it might work. Then an archaeologist put it on the ground. This is Kenneth Hirth, who's, I think I always get this wrong. This is for the early post-classic site of Xochicalco, where he's taking Lockhart's model, and this is starting to look like a map, where here's your palace, okay, here's the normal people, here's your territories, and there's a cluster in the middle, all right? And for those of you that know Chaco, you should start to be very afraid right now. Okay, then my friend Gerardo Gutierrez, who's working on this stuff, said, well, it's not really an egg crate, okay? The egg crate comes from this conceptual model, okay? It's not really an egg crate, it's more of a pizza slice sort of deal, where you got a place in the middle where something very important happened, and these are the palaces of these nobles, and then they have a territory, they have a hinterland that stretches out. Does this sound familiar? That's what Chaco is. It's that central settlement. Chaco Canyon, why was it Chaco Canyon? I don't know, but it was really important as early as 500 AD, back in Basket Maker 3, for those of you that remember the first slides. Something really important happened to Chaco. I only say that because there's huge basket maker sites there. That normal basket maker 3 site is one pit house. If you have a basket maker 3 site with 10 pit houses, you write a book and retire. There are 2 basket maker 3 sites at Chaco that have 100 pit houses and each has a great kiva. And there's probably a third one underneath Pueblo Bonito. I mean, something was really important at 500 AD. 500 years later, these guys come back and they capitalize on that. They've gone through this era of great houses reacting to Hohokam and all that stuff. They take it back to where it all begins, and this is what the Spanish called a city when they come into Mesoamerica. According to the guys that are working there now, it's not really a city. It's you can't have this without the countryside, without the hinterland. There's a concentration of noble families, disproportionate concentration of noble families, with their commoners out here, and then there's guys out in the woods. That's this. I think Chaco was an altepetal. Let me put it this way. This makes so much more sense to me. It makes sense out of Chaco so much more so than trying to make it into a pueblo and explain it with sodalities and medicine societies and stuff like that. It makes more sense than making it a uniquity, all right? If we have to invent something new to explain this thing, it's exciting, but I think the truth is it's just a garden variety Mesoamerican structure. It's local people, all right? Local people doing it their own way, but when it came time to form a state, these guys down south had done all the heavy lifting. They already had this form. This form of polity. Okay, Mesoamerican altepetal, surely it's bigger. No, it's 50, 60,000 people. This is not the Aztec Empire. Okay, for Chaco, downtown in Chaco itself, you probably had 3,000 people. But over this area, you probably had 50, 60,000 people. I mean, they're comparable in scale. Just in Mesoamerica, this thing's smallish. It'll cover 20, 30 miles because you can grow a lot of corn down there. Up here, you have to take that and spread it out because you can't grow a lot of corn up here. You have to put people where the corn will grow. You link it with roads and line-of-sight communication systems and all the apparatus that Chaco had that held this territory together. I think, for me, I think we figured out Chaco. Okay. By thinking big and not selling them short. Okay, my last conclusion was because this matters. Or does it? I think it matters on two levels, or in two ways, not two levels. You try and think what does southwestern archaeology actually do? What is it good for aside from the local economy? Lewis Henry Morgan looked at Chaco and places like Chaco. He actually looked, he didn't go to Chaco. He read everything he could about it, and he said, it's a commune. All right, this is part of this, in this Pueblo space. He thought everything in the New World was a commune. There were no governments in the New World. There were no nobles. And this is the father of American anthropology. That's who that is. In addition to being the father of American anthropology, and the guy who trained the guy who trained the guy who trained the guy who trained me, he was also read by these guys. Not so much Marx, but Friedrich Engels. And they thought that was pretty cool that you could build a thing like Chaco with a communal government, or no government, excuse me, with, in a communal system. It sort of proved that Marxism could work. Well, Marxism didn't work. You never would have heard of Marx if it hadn't been for this guy, for Lenin. Marx would just be an obscure German failed social philosopher. But Lenin took it and ran with it. So you could say that Chaco matters. Chaco matters because he was wrong, and he caused the 20th century. Much of it. But on another more immediate level, okay, I've just been sitting here talking about how Chaco is a Mesoamerican polity. It's an altepedal, all right? The Aztecs, when the Spanish came in, talked about their homeland far to the north at Aztlan. All right, nobody knows where Aztlan was. One of the Aztec emperors said, they sent out an expedition, said, find me out, where's Aztlan? Where'd we come from? And there's all kinds of stories about that. Some of those stories surfaced in a map in 1810 by Alexander von Humboldt, who is a very, very respected geographer and naturalist, German or Swiss, I can't remember, who published this map of the Southwest. And you can sort of see where you are here. This is the Rio Grande. And you can't read this. I can't read it right now. But up here it says this is the first home of the Aztecs. And it's up there someplace on the San Juan. And then the second home of the Aztecs is Casas Grandes, down south of Phoenix. The third home of the Aztecs, from which they left to Mexico, is Casas Grandes, Paquime. Humboldt never made it to the Southwest. He's working with old Mexican maps. He was in Mexico City looking at 17th century maps, maybe even 16th century maps, maybe even native maps. And he produced this map, and he thought it was probably right. Now, this is 1810. Just before the war with Mexico, the Mexican government made sure that everybody saw this map. All right, they thought, you're not going to take this land from us, it's ours. But we took it from them. Anyway, and it surfaces again in the 60s in Chicano civil rights. The Plan Espiritual de Aztlan was actually signed in Denver, just down the road from where I live. A fundamental document of Chicano civil rights. And it came right out and said the Southwest is Aztlan. And that we don't need a green card to come back here because this is home. This is where the Aztecs came from. I mean, and it's a very serious document and a very important document in American history and certainly in Latino civil rights. It was a rallying cry, and you would see T-shirts with this kind of stuff back in the 60s and 70s. Then it sort of, it turned more into a metaphor, and it powered or underwrote a lot of wonderful poetry and art. But it was it wasn't really a territorial claim. I mean, nobody's, well, actually there are some groups that want to separate the Southwest. But it's surfacing again, I think, in the context of the border troubles and the immigration and all the stuff that's going on. The Southwest Aztlan is being taught in California school systems and California universities. I'm not sure it's wrong. I don't think people from the Southwest were the Aztecs, but I think people from the Southwest, especially the noble families who aren't here anymore, moved south and were part of this long and complicated ribbons of dominoes that had to fall to get the Aztecs into Mexico from the Grand Chichimeca. I think the Southwest was part of that history, and it'd be interesting to see how, again, this doesn't matter. This isn't going to matter in terms of immigration and actual policy making, except that a lot of the guys who are now senators and governors and leaders of their community are my age and grew up in the 60s when that Plan de Aztlan was, that was there all the time. So I think it's really interesting. As an academic, I can sit there, this is really interesting. It could have interesting ramifications. To think big about the Southwest and to don't sell them short and to let them have their noble families who wanted to be Mesoamerican nobles, and it worked for a while. It went away. After 1300, remember the change in the art? After 1300, Pueblo people voted with their feet, said, we're out of here, we're not doing this anymore. We've seen the kings, it stinks. It ended very badly with a lot of violence. And Pueblo people, I think, deliberately turned their back on all that. And they put in place all kinds of social mechanisms. I can't get back to that first slide. All kinds of social mechanisms to make sure there never was another king. They did have egalitarian, Pueblos are egalitarian, they are communal, they are all those things that is in that box, that space that archaeologists are comfortable with. But in the past, significant parts of their society were not. And that's that history that I think we're just starting to understand. We went from this business of trying to turn ancient people into Pueblos in the most efficient way possible. We didn't let them have a history. And it's really encouraging to see the younger people coming up now. They're really interested in trying to tease out history. I didn't get it right in my book. Well, no. I'll tell you this after you buy the book. I didn't get it right in the book, but I think it's righter or more right than what else is on offer out there at this point. Anyway, I think I kept you long enough, and I apologize for the AV stuff. I hope it wasn't too terrible, but thank you very much.